Today's CEO Cafe is brought to you by the Bank of Nashville, as we have for the last 3 years. This is our 3rd anniversary beginning with this episode, and it features MarkLeap, who is the Vice President of Citigroup and is in the field of risk management. His topic today is what keeps you up at night, which is the analysis of risk for businesses, those perceived and those that you cannot detect. So without further ado, let me introduce MarkLeap, former Vice President of Citigroup, and today's topic.
Hello, I'm Roddy Story from the Bank of Nashville. I'm the manager of the commercial banking department. And last night I told my daughter, she always asks, like, you know, what are you doing tomorrow? And I don't know how many of y'all have daughters, but my daughter can give some advice. I suspect your daughters can give some advice. And she said, I'd like to give you 3 words that really help you. And I'm going to write them down on a piece of paper and put them in your jacket. But don't look at it till tomorrow. So I thought, you know, I love you, Dad. Make eye contact, scan the room, speak slowly. Her 3 words were no dumb jokes. So we want to thank y'all for coming. As y'all know, we're committed to commercial banking and individual banking in the middle market. This is where our business is. This is the 12th in a series that we put on spanning about 3.5 years. We have DVDs that you can pick up as you leave on the prior episodes. I was fortunate enough to eat lunch with MarkLeap about a year ago. And it was like 4 or 5 of us, and it's one of these typical things where somebody asks a question and you know, sort of go back and forth. Then somebody directed a question to Mark, and after that, he was on autopilot. All the questions started going to Mark, and he went for about 1.5 hours, and at the end, about 4 of us looked at each other and just said, wow. So y'all have got a real treat, and I think you'll really enjoy his comments. I want to thank Kim at Channel 10. She, as you know, and her crew filmed this, and she's been a big help to this whole process. I also want to thank Josh, Paul, and Kira at eSpaces. And I'd like to introduce now Jim Fuller. Jim is the guy that came to us about 2.5 years ago and said, I've got this cool idea for the CEO Cafe. And we thought it sounded great, and I talked to Hunter, and he said, we don't know how to do that, so why don't you see if we can just write a check? So that's our input. Jim has been the engine that's made this go, and I want to thank y'all for coming. We very much appreciate it. I'd like to turn it over to Jim.
There is a bit of a milestone we've reached. August 16th last month was the 3-year anniversary. It was 2007 when this first CEO Cafe took place. We've had a series of wonderful speakers. I ran into Clayton McWhorter, our 2nd speaker, last week, and then went home and watched him on TV again. So it's continued to be shown after 3 years. But I think the key point in there is that the Bank of Nashville has committed to a program like this for the community, and every speaker that has spoken has talked about the number of people who've come up to them and talked about the lessons they learned from this kind of business discussion. So I think we'd be amiss if we didn't note that anniversary and the Bank of Nashville's commitment, even during these troubled times that our country and our city have had, to continuing this commitment, which shows their commitment to the community of Nashville and its business growth. So let's give them a hand before we start. MarkLeap and his lovely wife, Barbara, moved here about the same time the CEO Cafe began and has assimilated into Nashville about as well as any couple I've ever seen in my life. They have discovered Fly, Tennessee, which I didn't know about, and discovered Whitwell, Tennessee, and the heritage program that they did with the Holocaust study. Mark even went to Whitwell, Tennessee, interviewed the teacher that started the program, went to Fly, Tennessee, met with the general store owner whose name was Fly, and got the history of that. It's that kind of intellectual curiosity that I think you'll see how valuable that was when it flowed into the Nashville community, into his corporate history. He has even signed up at Vanderbilt to take guitar lessons from one of our top guitar players, Jerry Kimbrough, who's here with us today. So he's totally assimilating into Music City. Mark's 35-year career has all been in financial management, the financial management industry. 25 years of that with Citigroup and then with Citicorp, and then they asked him to stay on to conduct upper-level training for worldwide management folks who would come into Citicorp. Those studies would take place in New York and London and tell me again, Hong Kong? Tokyo and Istanbul. Mark has, I kidded him yesterday about being the Forrest Gump of the management industry because he's ended up in so many unique places, except he brought with him that curiosity and gathering of knowledge. At one point was asked by the CEO to be a part of a special small task force that would look at best practices in their 140 employee company and compare that with best practices and performance in other industries. So he had the opportunity to go to automotive industry, manufacturing, even NASCAR, and look at their best practices and bring that back into Citigroup. The kind of experience that he's had flowed into that training series, and he became particularly interested in risk, realizing that you can grow and build and become bigger and bigger, but protecting against risk. He asked me, is anybody going to get up at 7:30 in the morning to come talk about risk? But we have a guru on that subject, and I'm pleased to have him here. At his request, this will be less of a speech and a presentation and more of a conversation, which is exactly what the CEO Cafe's original philosophy was. So join with me in welcoming Mark.
Well, thank you. I am surprised by how many people actually got here this morning. Somebody who goes to Fly, Tennessee and Whitwell sounds like somebody with too much time on their hands. And just in case you're wondering which Citigroup we're talking about here, Jim mentioned that it had 140 people, and I think he meant we were in 140 countries and had 137,000 employees. So is you all familiar with that, I'm sure. So it was a big place. It's an even bigger place today by almost any measurement you want to measure, even after the troubles of the last few years.
We talked about risk, and the title we ended up with, thanks to Ann Livingston, was what helps you sleep at night or what keeps you awake at night. Tell us about that title and how we got into this subject area and what brought you to it.
Well, I figured if I used the title that we would actually use in the company to present this material, nobody would come because it was pretty arcane and esoteric. But as we were talking about this between ourselves and Ann and others and Phil, the conversation kept coming back to what is it we're trying to accomplish by all this. And my notion was that the reason that you're thinking and worrying about managing risk in the business community is so that you can sleep well at night. And I kept saying that, and Ann picked up on that and said, well, that's what we'll just call this. So this is going to be a conversation around a little bit of background to understand how it kind of evolved. We're going to talk a little bit about a process or a tool you might want to think about in your business for thinking about the risks. Then we're going to talk a little bit about some other things that naturally follow on after that.
So in terms of risk, how did you get involved in thinking this much about risk throughout your career?
Well, I was a managing director of one of the divisions at Citi in the corporate bank. And I had a mentor who at that point was the senior risk officer in the corporation. And I called him and said, you know, I'm thinking about maybe it's time to reach out and do something else. And he said, well, let me tell you what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about forming a little task force of a small group of people. And we want to examine how we manage risk in this place. Now, the time frame we're talking about here is about 1992. And at that point, Citi had just come off of some pretty rough years in the late 80s and very early 90s, where as a result of some problems that we had in our leveraged buyout, the LBO business, and in our commercial or real estate portfolios, we had to take some pretty large write-downs and write-offs. And that followed on a period of time during the mid-'80s when the company had written down a lot of its exposure to country obligations that it held, mainly in South America, but other places as well. And so the share price at that time had dropped to a low of just under $8. And at the time that we were forming this little task force, the share price had rebounded to in the 20s, but was still trading at an earnings multiple significantly below that of our peer group. And so a fair amount of research was done to determine that, in fact, Citi's share price as a result of its multiple was being heavily discounted because of what the investment community felt was a poor or certainly inadequate risk management policy. Earnings would fluctuate dramatically, related primarily to risk management practices. So this task force was formed. We reported directly to the chairman, and who was John Reed at the time. And we had the support of all the senior line managers throughout the company. And the idea was to look for, as Jim mentioned, for best practices both inside the company, outside the industry, and identify things that would solve some of the problems that we perceived to exist in the company. Also, we interviewed the vast majority of line management folks in the corporate bank all over the world to get their ideas as to what was, where the fixes needed to be implemented. And so as a result of that, we started off on this project. And one of my favorite stories out of that is that, as you might imagine, a big international financial services company is doing business in all these different countries. And one of the ways that you decide about how you're going to do business in a country is you establish risk limits for the individual countries. How much exposure are you going to be willing to take? And so the way that is aggregated is through a variety of reporting systems, and actually the FDIC requires that number, how much your exposures are in various countries. Other governmental regulatory authorities around the world also require it. And certainly the accountants wanted it to put in the annual report every year. So every year we would aggregate, actually we do it for the reports, but we do it on a period, we did it monthly, and we aggregated the reports. Well, the notion came up that maybe this number was not being properly collected, and decisions, important decisions about where we invested were being based on these reports. So one of the little projects, this wasn't the major, but one of the little projects was to understand how country risk exposure was calculated in various countries, all countries, and then how it was aggregated and reported. Well, as you might imagine, everybody in their own little country, as you might suspect here, felt they were doing a terrific job and were doing it properly. And what we found was that there was a variety of ways that people were doing it. And in fact, when you added up the numbers, you were adding apples and oranges in many cases. And so we did what's called process mapping, where you go into a particular activity and you look at the very starting point of where that activity begins, and you map it all the way through, identify all the touch points, what decisions are made, all the systems issues, all the systems connectivity, and you get to, so you start in the Philippines, for example, and you end up in reporting the number in New York. You start in Turkey, and you end up reporting the number in New York. You start in Spain, you start in China. So anyway, we did this in not all 140 countries, but we did it in a large number of countries, and we found where all these differences were. I was able to put together a little presentation and present this to the senior management of the company, chairman, the senior risk officer, the guy who actually signed off on the numbers every year, and actually every quarter for the FDIC. And I remember the look in his eye. He looked at me like, oh, so that's how we do it. Like, you know, he had no clue. He's at the top. The numbers are coming up. He's making very important decisions about how much exposure we take in these countries, and realizing that the data was, I wouldn't say it was corrupted, but it was not accurate, and it was not timely. Some systems were able to report that data on an hourly basis practically, or certainly a daily basis, while other countries were reporting it at least a week or longer, stale dated. So, and as you know, in a lot of country business, you do trading activity, and so in a trading business, you know, you can have wild fluctuations in your exposures moment to moment, let alone a week away. So it just points out that you can have all these fancy systems and you can have all this experience sitting around the room, but if you're looking at data that's you don't understand where it comes from, you're probably taking a pretty big risk in terms of the decisions you're trying to make.
So in terms of risk, how do you think about risk as it relates to a business model, and is there a working definition we can use today for our purposes?
Well, today, there's a lot of definitions of risk. If you go to Webster's or any of the Wikipedia and you type in risk, I mean, you're going to be inundated with definitions. But for today, the way we looked at it was, we want to know what events are likely to occur that will cause a change to the planned result, financial result, of a business proposition. And we want to know what the probability of that event occurring within a specified time frame. So all we're worrying about here or all we're going to think about today is, what are the things that are going to likely cause the business proposition of a company or a business enterprise to be affected.
Now, sleep well at night. Explain that. What do you mean by that phrase?
Well, any consultant that comes into your business and says, chances are the first words out of their mouth are, now tell me, David, tell me, what keeps you awake at night? And that's supposed to be the lead-in to sharing your troubles or your concerns, which gives the accountants, the consultants, you know, they go ching, ching, ching. They start prioritizing where they're going to end up, having the nicest billing activity as a result of solving your problem. So this approach, what we're going to talk about today, is a concept that says, let's understand what we're really trying to do, and to the extent that we can do it ourselves, let's do it ourselves. Now, there's lots of times you need to reach out for help. I'm not suggesting you don't do that. But at least have a going-in idea as to where the risks are, what the likelihoods are, what the likelihood of this is. Now, to do that, you have to have some metrics in your business that identify activities that are off plan. And if you have something that is a risk that you can actually quantify and specify a probability, we would call that an expected risk. An expected risk would be something that you understand well enough that's likely to happen that you actually price into your cost of doing business. But we all know there are other kinds of risks out there. BP has an expected risk that there's going to be fires on their platforms from time to time. And they know that they've got to price into their cost of doing business the cost of managing fire control on platforms. What they don't know is that platforms are going to melt and fall over and cause disruptions the way that we had in the Gulf. And so that kind of activity is an unexpected risk. And it's the unexpected risks that aren't priced into the business, but you are expected to maintain capital, or in BP's case, a liquidity plan, adequate or sufficient enough to deal with what you believe could be the expected risks. So you can continue on after they occur, keep the doors open, keep the lights on, and often you'll find that this leads to a notion of economic capital. And economic capital, if you do that calculation in your business, you'll find will vary quite differently from what market cap is or what accounting capital may be. I mean, it's a very different number. It's a very different concept. But it's an important concept from the standpoint of risk management, because the reserves you take, what you price into your business, will deal with your expected risks, but your capital and your liquidity plans are there to absorb the shocks from the unexpected risks. And that's always a contentious discussion, because most management teams are measured on a variety of things, but very often on return on capital. And so when it comes to, you'll find that it's likely that the economic capital in your business will be the larger of the three numbers. And so if you're a line manager, you do not want to have economic capital in your calculation, because it lowers your return and could have a direct impact on your compensation. So there's always a bit of a debate about people who think they have risk in their business that are managing the business, and people who think they have risk in their business who are providing the capital for the business. So, but the notion of economic capital comes out. Then, okay, so we have these metrics that provide the data that's coming out of your company, but frankly, risks that take down a company or have a severe impact on share price rarely come from the direction you're looking. I mean, if you're looking for a risk, you probably have a plan in place, and you probably have a pretty good system of knowing what to do. It's the risks that come from the areas that you're not expecting the risk to materialize. An example might be a company that's got inventory, and they have a history of inventory shrinkage. And so they can calculate what the expected risk is from inventory shrinkage. Risk being, remember, an event that causes a deterioration of the expected cash flows in the business proposition. Okay, so all of a sudden, the reports come in, and there's an extreme inventory shrinkage way beyond what was expected. And so the manager looks at this and says, whoa, I didn't see that coming. Well, that's an unexpected risk. So you do, in addition to your various metrics, you do need to have radar systems that are giving you suspicions or hints and pointed in directions where you may never have had a risk event in the past to make sure that there isn't going to be a disruption to your cash flows. But the question is, I can't just be building radar systems all over the place. I mean, my God, I don't have that's not the very efficient way to go about it. So you need a plan to figure out where those radar systems might need to be.
There's probably a lot of different businesses represented here, and even more who will be watching this on Channel 10. All of them have different descriptions. Most of them have missions or mission statements. What's the difference between that and a business proposition?
Okay, yeah, we're going to use the word business proposition a couple of times here this morning. Here's my working definition for that. and let's first of all start with a business description. If you get introduced to your friend or you meet people here at the CEO Cafe and they say, well, tell me about your business. You're going to say, well, you know, I make widgets and I sell widgets. And I sell widgets to these companies because they love widgets. And by the way, I make the best widget there is. Okay, that's interesting. Or they may say, tell me what the mission of your company is. Well, the mission of my company is to make sure I have happy employees, to make sure that I'm the preferred choice of my customers, and to make sure that we provide an adequate return to our shareholders. Well, those are interesting objectives. Doesn't tell me much about the business. The business proposition is a description of how you make money. In other words, it's a way of, in your own terms, being able to articulate what it is that you do that causes your financial targets to be met and causes them to be met on a sustainable basis. And I was once told that if you can't write it on the back of your business card, you either don't have one or don't know what it is. But I don't know.
So what approach do you use to identify these risks?
Well, I had some great help here. I was going to use the whiteboards for this, but Dale has helped me with this. So can we crank on the screen here a little bit? I'm going to show you a notion here, which I refer to as, by the way, I'm the originator of this thought, in case you followed mine. Does anybody know who Willie Sutton is or was? Willie Sutton? Willie Sutton was a bank robber. And Willie Sutton was caught and was released and went out and robbed more banks. And was caught, released, and went out and robbed more banks. And they said, Willie, why do you do that? You're just going to get caught. He says, because that's where the money is. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to try, I'm going to show you a model. Now, there's lots of models out there to do this. What I'm going to show you today is a version that I think is generic enough that it'll work for most of you in this room. There are certainly many more esoteric approaches here, but I just want to have you capture the notion, because if somebody sits down and says, build a radar system to detect find all the risks, you're going to say, well, I could start writing down my checklist of where I think the risks are. But what we're going to show you is a kind of an organized way to think about it. Now, there's a lot going on this screen, and those in the back of the room, I'm sure, cannot read it. So I will, I don't like to show a slide that's got this much going on initially, but we really, in the time frame we've got, we couldn't figure out a better way to do it. And I'm going to read what's going on for those that are like me and have 2400 vision and forgot their glasses today. But at any rate, the purpose of this slide is to take what most all of you are familiar with, and that is an organization of business constituencies, and array them in such a way that we can begin to think about where the risks are in a business by following the money. And so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the suppliers. The first thing a business does is it has to get something in to the business in order to produce whatever its goods or services for its customers. And the green arrow, the red arrow is got boxes there, and it says stuff. Now, stuff becomes important later. We don't know what your business is. We just know that you get stuff from someplace. But you have risks with suppliers. You have concentration risks, you have dependency risks, you have reliability risks, you have quality risks, you may have security risks, you may have a lot of other risks. So how do you find out what risks you've got? Well, you get everybody that's involved with dealing with your suppliers, you get them in a room, you tell them what they're coming for, and you spend a few minutes, and they go through and they tell you where they think all the risks are. And you say, thank you very much. And now you've got sort of a base idea of where your supplier risk may be. You may have more, but at least you've got a going-in idea. Okay, so then we move from suppliers to service vendors. These are people who come to your plant and work on your facilities and do the kinds of things that allow the facility to operate properly. And again, you have similar kinds of risks. Okay, and you have staff. Now, with staff, they're giving you skills, and they're giving the company skills, and you're giving them some money. And I think you can see the risks you have here. what's in the back of the room, what this says is intellectual capital, succession or turnover, skill levels, training, where to train, where not to train, skills backup, somebody goes down, somebody gets injured, how are we going to replace that person? Fraud, theft. The list here is lengthy. How do you do it? Again, you get people in the room who worry about staff. They help you fill out this list, okay? Professional support. These are your consultants. They're your IT people. You may have external IT support. You may have legal, accounting, advertising, who knows, whatever it is. But anyway, you do the same kind of thing. And you have clients. Now, with clients here, we actually have products and clients, because clients don't matter if you don't have products. And so what happens there, you got to look at the product and services feature separately, because there you might have quality control issues, you may have product liability issues, you may have even production cycle issues, you could have all kinds of things, risks that could possibly interrupt the ability to deliver a product, because a customer isn't going to pay you if you don't deliver the product back. Now you see there's another little set of green arrows going up to clients there. What's that all about? Well, that's because, remember, we're following all the money activity here. And some of the money activity could be related to returns, warranties, repairs, who knows what. But there's always some money that goes back to clients in most businesses. So the notion is, again, lay this out in such a way that you can find where all the green arrows are, and then you think about all the activities that could go on in these bubbles that would result in a disruption of that cash coming into the company. Okay. Now, I've left capital to the end. And the reason I've left capital to the end is because there's two, we're all familiar with the two broad categories of capital. But there's risks associated with the capital providers. For example, in your lenders, you may be borrowing or getting all your borrowed funds from one source. Now, if that source is Citigroup and has problems, that might not be a good thing. You may want to have some diversity to your funding sources. You may have dependencies on certain kinds of borrowings for certain kinds of activities that would come out of this. You may have availability questions. You may have lines of credit, but they'd only be available to you under certain kinds of conditions. And so you have to understand and be aware that you're meeting all those conditions in order to have those lines available to you. I can't tell you the number of customers that we had when I was back in the day thinking that they had availability when in fact there were conditions or covenants that they might have had to fulfill in order to draw down on their funds. And they might have ratings, and we're going to talk about ratings if you have public debt. There are huge risks associated with ratings that most people just don't even think about. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later too. Okay? So now we have the business proposition. This is a schematic that says to the observer how I make money. I get stuff in, and I add skill to that, and stuff plus goes out, presuming you're adding some value to what it is you do. So we call this the stuff and skills slide, because as stuff comes in from a variety of places, skills come in from a variety of places, and stuff goes out. Presumably stuff goes out only to clients, but sometimes it goes to other places too. Now, there's another feature of this slide that I want to add, and that is businesses don't operate in their own little world. They operate in an industry, and if they're a multi-line business, they may operate in multiple industries. They operate within economies, and if they're an international or a global company, they may operate within a variety of economies. And so you have to also think about whether you have industry specific risks or economic specific risks. That's not the job of the staff, by the way. That's the job of what you all get paid the big bucks for running the company, figuring out what those risks are. Okay, so now we know where we need to build our radar. We're starting to identify our particular risks. So let me just what you zero in on, just to go back a little bit here, remember you zero in on a bubble, you bring the people who are connected with that bubble into a place, you sit down and you say, now what are all the possible things that could interfere with our ability to get the cash from these guys? And here you could have concentrations in customers, you could have competition risk, you could have delivery requirement risk. They may have special requirements that you have to fulfill that you may or may not be able to do on a routine basis. They may have changing needs. You may have to worry about a change in your product line. They may have credit issues. You would, if you sell on credit, you may not want to be doing business with people who have whose credit capacity is declining, and you may have reputation risks. Those of you in the banking business, I'm sure, are probably, I won't say more familiar with it, but familiar with it in the way that I am, and that is we had policies at Citibank that would cause us to choose not to do business with certain kinds of enterprises. And in order to do any kind of business with an enterprise that was on that restricted list was required very senior authority to do, in some cases board authority. And that's because there are certain kinds of things that your business may not want to be associated with. So clients may bring that into, and it happens in a very, it happens in funny ways. You could have a hotel chain, for example, that decides they want to get into buy a hotel in Las Vegas. And so they might not have had any gambling activities in any of their other hotels, but they may buy a hotel in Las Vegas that's got gambling activities. Now, if you're a bank, and you're like Citi, that has a restriction on doing business with gaming and gambling activities, companies that are in that business, what do? Do you throw out Hilton hotels because they have a hotel in one or two hotels in Las Vegas that are in the gaming business? They have other hotels that are in the gaming business, by the way. But anyway, so it can come in through mergers. It can come in a variety of different ways that are very require interesting techniques to get around. Okay, so that's it. Now, what do you do with all this stuff? You've got your list of risks. You've presumably spent a little time to develop some probabilities, and you start to array them on some form of a scattergram like this, and array them with the idea of, I want to know what the relative, I want to position them with respect to impact and probability. Now, I've added a third dimension. There is actually a third dimension, which you can see in the background there, called confidence, because if you have something that's high impact, high probability, and you have a high confidence in your assessment, then that's why the circle exists up there, and that's why you want to go spend a little more attention perhaps to those, the risks that are in that part of the quadrant first. And they could be risks from a variety of different sources. I mean, you might have staffing risks in there, you might have supplier risks in there, who knows? It doesn't necessarily mean they're all going to fall from the same category, because you've got that other array going on behind the scenes. Now, my notion is that if you spend the time and do all that, and you can have some confidence that you've got the risks arrayed the way you like them, that you'll be better able to sleep at night, perhaps, than you were before. I'm not saying it'll be perfect sleep, but you'll be better off.
Well, we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, but what would be the traps in here that we need to pay attention to?
Well, I think I'll just sort of tick off a few. If you identify a risk, and let's say a risk is that the building's going to burn down. Now, this is a risk that you're all going to understand. You see fires in the news all the time. So you say, no problem. I'm going to go get fire insurance. And we all know that you have to be. You've just shifted the risk from fire insurance from the building operating to the creditworthiness and the collectability of your fire insurance policy. But I'm just saying there's other risks here too. There's the risk of the business interruption. Now, you might have business interruption insurance, no problem. You get paid for not being in business. But your client said, you know, you were out of business for 6 months. I needed that stuff plus during that time. I I went to Schmedley over here and got stuff plus plus. And so we're not going to be doing business with you in the same way. So there are many other kinds of examples, but I'm just saying that when you have a risk, there's the knock-on effect, and you don't really eliminate the risk, you just have shifted the risk to a different type of risk. If that building burns down, if that event occurs, you have a significant risk to your cash flows, and you need to think through all the issues that are associated with where that cash flow interruption might be. Let me just say that I can't underscore the necessity for building checklists when you have time-sensitive responses. If you've incurred a risk and you have to respond to it quickly, don't rely on your 25 or 30 years of experience to be able to do it, because you're going to be there's so much input coming into you that you've got to be sure you're doing it correctly. So don't overestimate the value of checklists. Don't overestimate the value of fire drills. If you think there's a risk that could result from a certain activity, test it. Run a fire drill. See how people react, and make sure that it's we're practical. I guess a couple others is that believing everybody in the enterprise, in your business, has the same definition of what the risk is. You may put a risk on I may put a risk on the board here, for example, but I'll guarantee you, if we went around and said, what does that mean to you? What does that mean to you? We would have perhaps we'd all be in the same big box, but we wouldn't be, the chances of us being specifically identical would be remote. And so make sure if you've got big risks in your company that you want people to be aware of, you've defined what they are, and that you have a plan behind them to, I guess the last thing I would say here is that if you build a radar system that you're very proud of that's going to identify this risk this asteroid when it comes and destroys the planet, you just make sure it's turned on. And then also make sure that it's properly manned. One of the best historical examples here occurred in Pearl Harbor. The government knew that there was a likelihood of an Japanese aircraft attack at the bases at Pearl Harbor. And so they had a radar system up, and the radar system worked. It was on. And it detected the planes that were coming in. The two guys that were working there, though, looked up, said, oh, those are guys returning from a training mission. No problem. And went back to playing pinochle. And so, again, testing of your systems will determine whether or not your radars are turned on and whether they're properly manned.
Citicorp obviously went from under $10 a share to over $180 a share, and a lot of the things you've talked about helped make that happen. It also then made a decline. Talk about that.
Well, when we were putting this talk together, somebody said, you're going to talk about risk? Come on now. In the words of Monday Night Football, come on now. What happened? And first of all, there are many factors that went into what happened at Citi, and I don't pretend to be able to talk to them all. And if you ask anybody who spent any time there about what happened, it's sort of like the three blind men that are trying to describe what an elephant looks like. It really kind of depends on where your perspective is as you're trying to describe what the problems were to other people. But I will tell you that I know, it's my belief, having been away for 10 years, that there were at least 3 things that I can point to that were serious problems. After the merger occurred, the merger was announced in April of 1998. It was concluded in October of 1998, conditionally approved by the FDIC, because at that point there was this thing called Glass-Steagall, which prevented the commercial banking and investment banking businesses from being combined. So it was conditionally approved by the FDIC. It was eventually, the Glass-Steagall was repealed, FDIC removed its conditional approval. Katie barred the door. We were ready for business. Okay. Well, what happened just because the merger was approved on paper, the merger was not affected at the business levels for a significant amount of time. And I think we have some ex-city people, or a couple of ex-city people in the room here, I'm sure, can attest to this, that the integration of the business units and the integration of the cultural management styles, to the extent that they ever occurred, took a while, and a long time. In some cases, never really merged. I mean, they sold off the Travelers unit, early 2000, mid 2000, they sold off Smith Barney, and so the company that existed after that was not exactly the same companies that were merged. But there was a serial dismantling of some of these processes, and I'm reminded of the Smoky Mountains story. These two good old boys are driving through the roads in the Smoky Mountains, and they windy roads, and they come around a corner, and they see the sign that says, "Slow down, curvy road." And the one guy says to the other, Jeb says to Seth, says, "You know, this is a beautiful valley out here." He says, "That sign, that sign's blocking the view. We haven't had an accident up here for as long as I can remember. So I think we should take the sign down." Well, that's sort of what happened at Citi. We had a lot of processes in place that were preventing these these unexpected risks of any magnitude from disrupting our earnings. And so they said, "We're not having those risks. Let's take the sign down. Let's sort of spend our money in growing the business and not so much in trying to worry about where these risks are coming from." So there was a serial dismantling of the place. The second thing was there were the authorities. I was a senior risk officer at Citi, and in order to become a senior risk officer, there was a number of hurdles that you had to jump through, a number of experiential kinds of things, and you had to demonstrate some ability to evaluate the risk in the business that you had authorities to grant approvals for. Well, I won't say that that notion went completely away, but the requirements to approve large amounts of capital to businesses, the requirements that were required for individuals to grant authorities to do business and to take risk was changed pretty dramatically. And specifically, the third event that happened was an over-reliance on special purpose vehicles. Now, special purpose vehicles were where all these investment banks and commercial banks were parking most of the subprime mortgage loans, among other things, so they could get the risks, get the assets off the balance sheet. And so what that led to was a mispricing of the risk. In some cases, they knew precisely what the risk was, but the cost of capital hurdle for a special purpose vehicle was significantly lower than it was for an on-balance sheet kind of asset. And so by ramping up the use of special purpose vehicles, they could throw all these underpriced, we'll call them for the moment anyway, underpriced assets, investments, into these vehicles. Well, that's fine if they're always going to stay in those vehicles. But what happens is when you are operating a business that relies on special purpose vehicles, you have other investors in these. And these other investors enter into these things with the notion that they're not going to incur any loss. And so you have a moral commitment. You don't have a legal commitment typically, but you have a moral commitment that if there's a loss or a bad asset, you replace the asset, or you buy back the asset, or you shut down the vehicle. Well, if you don't do that, then the rest of your special purpose vehicle activities collapses because the investment community loses faith. And what Citi was forced to do in order to preserve its credit card special purpose vehicles, its leasing special purpose vehicles, on and on and on, its commercial paper special purpose vehicle, on and on and on. In order to protect those business activities, it felt the need, it determined it had to repurchase those assets and put it back on its balance sheet and take that risk of loss away from the investors in those subprime mortgages. So it was I won't say it was a misunderstanding of the risk, but it was certainly an area where concentration of the risk was not fully understood or disclosed. There was a very famous earnings call. It was on the web. I happened to listen to it. Perhaps others of you did too. It took place in October of 2008, where some of the analysts asked this very question. Now, at the time, the share price had dropped from a high of about 55 to mid-40s or so, high 40s. And so the fellow who was responsible for the answer, the treasurer, CFO, gave an answer which the analysts interpreted to be they didn't know. They didn't know what the exposures were. They didn't know how these assets should be priced. And even if they did know, the impression was they didn't know. And that's what started the run for the hills. And if you look back at the charts of the share price, you'll find that between, I think that was October 30th or something, 2008, and between October 30th, 2008, the share price went from, say, mid-40s to trading under $1 in March of 2009.
Let's give Mark a hand.
I want to add. I want to add one more.
Add a footnote.
I want to add one more thing.
Okay.
Jim asked me a question. I know we're running out of time, but I want to add one more thing, and that is, Jim asked me, what about companies who think bigger is better, or who want to go get as much capital as they can so they can grow their business? And I said, well, a lot of people at Citi when I was there thought that bigger was better was in fact the right way to think about things. And I certainly will grant you that scale is important. But we came to the conclusion that better is better. And bigger may be an element of it, may not be an element. And I'm reminded, how many of you are familiar with the Darwin Awards? The Darwin Awards are given to people who do stupid things. And a couple of years ago, there was a guy who finished #1 on that list. And this was a guy who said, I want to set the land speed record for vehicles. So what he did was he went to a military surplus depot and bought the biggest jet engine he could buy. And he welded this jet engine on a car. And he took this car, hauled it out to the Bonneville Salt Flats, got in it, fired it up, and took off. And the paper reported the next day that based on the blotch on the side of the mountain, we estimate he was going 486 miles an hour on impact. So my caution to you who believe that you want to get bigger is remember, bigger cars require bigger brakes.
Very good. Any other questions real quick? We've got time for one or two. I know Scott Hunt and the Hunt brothers over here are going to say, what's a bank doing out analyzing NASCAR best practices? How did that happen and why?
Well, we talked to Scott about that because I know he sponsors a NASCAR. When we were looking at best practices, a lot of decisions in the banking business, and others too, require a very quick turnaround and often instantaneous, or require teams of people to come together and very quickly reach a decision and move on. And so we looked around for situations like that. And one of the situations that's like that is when a car in a NASCAR race comes into the pits. And here you have 18 guys and gals, mostly men I guess, but 18 people, some of which I think 13 or so are allowed over the wall, or I forget the exact number, but some are allowed over the wall, some are behind the wall. And instantaneously, and they know what's coming, and they're sort of prepared, but they do this ballet, this choreographed routine that fills the car with gas, changes the tires, cleans the windshield, pulls the body frame away from the side of the tire, does a number of other activities in a very short amount of time. So how do they do that? And so we were quite interested to interview the folks at a couple of different teams to figure out how they did that. And we used that in our trading business. We brought some of those processes into our trading business and some of them into our country risk programs. So anyway.
Good. Let's give them a hand.